I have visited my husband's grave every Sunday for 23 years. Rain or shine, snow or summer heat. I make the drive to Evergreen Cemetery with fresh flowers and words I have never stopped wanting to say. Richard Allen Mitchell. Beloved husband and father. The 15th of March 1959. The 22nd of March 2001. Gone too soon. Forever in our hearts. I know that headstone better than I know my own face in the mirror. I have traced those letters with my fingers 1,000 times. Have watched the granite weather and age while I weathered and aged alongside it. I have told that stone about every milestone our children achieved, every struggle I faced, every lonely night when I reached across the bed and found only empty space. Today was the 23rd anniversary of his death. I arrived at dawn, before the other mourners, before the groundskeepers began their work. I wanted privacy for what I had come to say. 23 years, Richard. I knelt on the grass, arranging the yellow roses he had always loved. The kids are doing well. James just got promoted again. Sarah's twins started kindergarten last month. Michael finally got his restaurant job, the one he's been wanting. I paused, pulling a weed that had sprouted near the base of the stone. I wish you could see them. I wish you could see who they've become. I had been 39 years old when the police came to my door. 2 officers in pressed uniforms, their faces arranged in expressions of practiced sympathy. There had been an accident, they said. A collision en route 128. Richard's car had gone off the road and into a ravine. The fire had been intense. They identified him through dental records and his wedding ring, which had somehow survived the flames. They did not let me see the body. The funeral director had gently suggested a closed casket, given the condition of the remains. I had agreed because I could not bear the thought of my last memory being something burned and broken. I wanted to remember Richard as he was. Handsome, charming, always ready with a joke and a smile. For 23 years, I had wondered if that was a mistake. I had wondered if seeing him one last time might have helped me let go, might have given me the closure I still could not find. I finished arranging the flowers and sat back on my heels. The morning sun was beginning to warm the cemetery, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. Somewhere nearby, a cardinal sang its territorial song. I never remarried, you know. I smiled at the stone, the same sad smile I had worn for more than 2 decades. People said I should. Nancy kept trying to set me up with men from her church. Even the kids encouraged me. Once they were grown, but I couldn't. It felt like betrayal. It felt like admitting you were really gone. I had built my entire identity around being Richard Mitchell's widow. I was the brave woman who had raised 3 children alone after tragedy struck. I was the devoted wife who kept her husband's memory alive through stories and photographs and annual visits to this patch of grass and granite. I was faithful to a man who had been dead for 23 years. After an hour at the grave, I drove home through familiar streets that held memories on every corner. The ice cream shop where Richard had proposed. The hospital where I had worked double shifts to pay the bills. The elementary school where I had watched our children grow up without their father. I had done everything alone. The school plays and sports games, the homework and the heartbreaks. The college applications and the graduations, 3 children raised from adolescence to adulthood by a woman who was barely holding herself together. But I had held together. That was the point. That was what I was proud of. I made it home by noon, exhausted in the way that grief always exhausted me. The anniversary was hardest. It brought back the raw wound of those first weeks. The disbelief and the despair and the desperate hope that someone would call and say there had been a mistake. No one ever called. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the living room, surrounded by photographs of our family. Richard at our wedding, young and hopeful. Richard holding baby James, terrified and proud. Richard with all 3 kids at Disney World, the last vacation we took together. He had been a good father, I told myself. He had loved us. Whatever struggles he had faced, whatever demons he had battled, he had loved us. I turned on the television for company, something I often did when the silence became too heavy. The local news was covering a charity gala, some business award ceremony in San Diego. I was only half paying attention, scrolling through my phone, when a name made me look up. And tonight's Entrepreneur of the Year award goes to Robert Santos, founder of the Santos Family Kitchen restaurant chain. The camera cut to a man walking toward the stage. He was older, heavier, with gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. But his walk was familiar. His smile was familiar. The way he tilted his head when he laughed was achingly, impossibly familiar. I dropped my phone. The teacup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. But I did not notice. I could not notice. I could only stare at the screen, at the man accepting his award, at the face I had mourned for 23 years, the face of my dead husband. I sat frozen on the couch, shards of broken teacups scattered around my feet, hot liquid soaking into the carpet. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered except the face on the television screen. Robert Santos was still speaking, thanking his employees, his family, his community. The camera loved him. He was confident, successful, the kind of man who commanded attention without demanding it. He gestured with his left hand as he talked, a habit Richard had always had. He paused at the same moments Richard would have paused, letting his jokes land before continuing. It was impossible. It was absolutely impossible. And yet, I grabbed the remote with trembling hands and rewound the broadcast. The local news had a feature that let you pause and replay, and I used it now, freezing the image on Robert Santos's face. I leaned forward until I was inches from the screen, studying every detail. The nose was the same, slightly crooked from a basketball injury in college. The ears were the same, with that distinctive attached lobe that all three of our children had inherited. The eyes were the same pale blue that had made me fall in love with him at a church social in 1978. He was heavier now, and the beard obscured the jawline I had once known so well. His hair had gone completely gray, whereas Richard's had only been starting to silver when he died. But beneath the years, beneath the changes that time brings to every face, the structure was unmistakable. I was looking at my husband. I fumbled for my phone and called my daughter Sarah with shaking fingers. She answered on the third ring, her voice cheerful. "Mom, how was the cemetery? Are you okay?" "Sarah." My voice came out strange, strangled. "I need you to come over. Right now." "What's wrong? Are you hurt? Just come. Please." "I can't explain over the phone." Sarah arrived in 20 minutes, still wearing her teaching clothes, her face tight with worry. I had not moved from the couch. I had not cleaned up the broken cup or the spilled tea. I had simply sat there, rewatching the news segment over and over, unable to believe what I was seeing. "Mom, you're scaring me." "What happened?" I pointed at the television, where I had paused Robert Santos mid-smile. "Look at him. Look at his face, and tell me what you see." Sarah frowned and moved closer to the screen. She studied the image for a long moment, then shook her head. "I don't understand." "Who is this?" "His name is Robert Santos. He owns a restaurant chain in San Diego. He just won some business award." I took a breath. "And he's your father." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, concern. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has lost their grip on reality. "Mom, Dad's been dead for 23 years. I know what I was told. But look at him, Sarah. Really look." She turned back to the screen, and I watched her study the frozen image with fresh eyes. I saw the moment recognition flickered across her features, quickly suppressed. "It's a coincidence," she said, but her voice wavered. "Lots of people look alike. The nose, the ears, the way he tilts his head." I stood and walked to the mantel, pulling down our wedding photograph. "Look at this picture and tell me, that's not the same man." Sarah took the photograph and held it up next to the television. Her face went pale. "Oh my God," she whispered. We spent the next 3 hours researching Robert Santos. The internet provided an abundance of information about San Diego's beloved restaurateur. He had founded Santos Family Kitchen in 2005, starting with a single location and expanding to 12 restaurants across Southern California. He was known for his community involvement, his generous charitable donations, his loving family. The words made my stomach turn. According to various interviews and profiles, Robert Santos had been married to his wife Maria for 19 years. They had 2 children, Carlos, 20, and Isabella, 18. In photographs, they looked happy, prosperous, blessed. They looked like the family Richard and I should have had. I found an interview where Robert discussed his background. He claimed to have grown up in Texas, moved to California in his early 40s to start fresh after a difficult divorce. There was no mention of Boston, no mention of a previous wife or 3 children, no mention of a tragic car accident that had supposedly taken his life. He had erased us. He had erased 22 years of marriage and 3 children and an entire life as completely as if we had never existed. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah said, pacing my living room. "Even if Dad somehow survived the accident, why would he fake his death? Why would he abandon us? Why would he never contact us in 23 years? I thought about the months before Richard's death. He had been stressed, distant, working late hours that never seemed to translate into extra income. I had attributed it to midlife malaise, to the pressure of providing for a family. I had never suspected anything more, but now I wondered. What had Richard been hiding? What had driven him to stage his own death and disappear? "We need to be sure," I said finally. "We need proof that Robert Santos is really your father before we do anything else." "How do we get proof?" I looked at the frozen image on the screen, at the man who had let me grieve for more than 2 decades. "We go to San Diego. We look him in the face, and we make him tell us the truth." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was hard, with an anger I had rarely heard from my gentle daughter. "If that's really Dad, if he's been alive this whole time while you worked double shifts and cried yourself to sleep and sacrificed everything for us." She clenched her fists. "Then I want to be there when he explains himself." I looked at Richard's photograph on the mantel, the smiling young man I had loved so completely. "So do I," I said. "So do I." Before we could fly to San Diego, we needed more than photographs and suspicions. We needed proof that would hold up under scrutiny, proof that could not be dismissed as grief-fueled delusion. Sarah took charge of the research with the methodical precision she brought to her classroom lesson plans. She created spreadsheets comparing every detail we could find about Robert Santos to what we knew about Richard Mitchell: height, approximate weight, age, mannerisms captured in video interviews. The similarities were overwhelming, but the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. I had kept boxes of Richard's belongings in the attic, unable to throw them away even after all these years. Among the old tax returns and faded photographs, I found something I had forgotten existed. Richard's journal from the year before his death. I had never read it. In the weeks after the accident, I had been too devastated to look at anything that reminded me of him. Later, when the grief had dulled to a manageable ache, it had seemed like a violation of his privacy. Dead or not, Richard deserved to keep his thoughts to himself. Now, sitting in my dusty attic with Sarah beside me, I opened the leather-bound notebook and began to read. The entries started innocently enough. Reflections on work, on family, on the small frustrations of daily life. But as the months progressed, the tone changed. Richard wrote about pressure, about impossible choices, about debts he could never repay. The 15th of January 2001. "I'm in too deep. Frank wants his money by March, or he says he'll come after the family. I can't let that happen. I won't let Eleanor and the kids pay for my mistakes." The 3rd of February 2001. "I've thought about every option. Bankruptcy won't help. These aren't the kind of debts that get discharged. I could go to the police, But then Eleanor would know everything. She'd never look at me the same way again. The 20th of February, 2001. There might be another way. A guy I met at the track told me about someone who can make problems disappear. New identity. New life. It would cost everything we have. But the insurance would take care of Eleanor and the kids. They'd be better off without me. The 10th of March, 2001. I've made my decision. By the time anyone reads this, I'll be gone. Not dead, just gone. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I'm sorry, kids. I wish I was a better man, but this is the only way to keep you safe. I set the journal down with shaking hands. The entries confirmed everything. Richard had planned his disappearance. He had chosen to abandon us. To let us believe he was dead. To collect insurance money that would become our only lifeline. $800,000, Sarah said, reading over my shoulder. He owed someone named Frank $800,000. She looked at me with horror in her eyes. Mom, that's more than the house was worth. Gambling, I said quietly. The pieces were falling into place. Your father had a problem. I suspected it, years ago, but he always denied it. He said the late nights were work, the missing money was bad investments. And you believed him? The accusation in her voice stung, but I could not deny it. I wanted to believe him. I wanted our family to be normal, to be happy. So I ignored the signs. I closed my eyes. I let myself be blind because the truth was too frightening to face. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into the box and pulled out another item. A business card. Worn and faded. Tucked between the journal's pages. Frank DeLuca. Private investments. A phone number with a Boston area code. This is the man Dad owed money to, Sarah said. If he's still alive, he might be able to confirm what happened. And if he's the kind of man who threatens families over gambling debts, he might not appreciate us asking questions. Do we have a choice? I thought about the comfortable life Robert Santos had built in San Diego. The restaurants, the awards, the beautiful new family. I thought about the 23 years I had spent working double shifts at the hospital, skipping meals so my children could eat, wearing the same clothes until they fell apart. He had built an empire while I struggled to survive. He had found happiness while I drowned in grief. He had started over while I remained trapped in the ruins of our marriage, faithful to a ghost who had never existed. No, I said finally. We don't have a choice. We need to know everything. The next morning I called James and Michael Jr. and asked them to come to dinner. I did not explain why. I simply said it was important, that there was something I needed to tell them. James arrived first, as he always did. He was the responsible one, the eldest, the child who had stepped into his father's role when Richard died. He had helped me with the younger kids, had worked part-time jobs through high school to contribute to the household, had grown up too fast because circumstances demanded it. Michael Jr. came 20 minutes late, also as he always did. He had struggled the most with his father's death. He had been only 10 when Richard died, old enough to remember him vividly, but too young to process the loss. The years that followed had been difficult. Rebellious behavior, substance abuse, a series of dead-end jobs. He had only recently found stability working as a chef at a local restaurant. Sarah was already there, her face carefully neutral. She knew what was coming. She had helped me prepare. I gathered my children in the living room. The same room where I had seen Richard's face on the television screen. The photograph from our wedding still sat on the mantel, the smiling young man who had promised to love me forever. I have something to tell you, I began. Something about your father. James leaned forward. What about him? I took a deep breath. He's alive. Your father is alive. And he's been living in San Diego for the past 20 years with a new wife and 2 new children. The silence that followed was absolute. Michael Jr. was the first to react. He laughed. A harsh sound that held no humor. That's insane, Mom. Dad died in a car accident. We went to his funeral. I threw dirt on his coffin. He shook his head. This is crazy. I know how it sounds. I pulled out my laptop and showed them the news segment, the photographs from Robert Santos's website, the comparison images Sarah had assembled. But look at him. Look at his face and tell me that's not your father. James had gone very still. He was staring at the screen with an expression I could not read, his face drained of color. James? I reached for his hand. Are you all right? He pulled away from me. I need some air, he said, and walked out the back door before I could stop him. Sarah and I continued explaining the evidence to Michael Jr., who moved through the stages of denial with increasing desperation. It was not possible. It could not be true. There had to be another explanation, but with each photograph, each video clip, each entry from Richard's journal, his resistance crumbled. He left us, Michael Jr. finally said, his voice breaking. He just left and let us think he was dead. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. 23 years, Mom. I've spent 23 years missing a man who was alive the whole time. Tears streamed down his face. Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep? Do you know how many times I wished I could talk to him just one more time? I knew. God, I knew. The years after Richard's death had been the hardest of my life. I had gone from being a stay-at-home mother with a comfortable middle-class existence to a single parent with 3 children and a mountain of bills. The life insurance money had helped, but it had not lasted as long as I had hoped. Funeral expenses, outstanding debts I had not known about, the everyday costs of raising 3 growing children. I went back to nursing within a month of the funeral. I worked every shift they would give me, often pulling double shifts back to back. I came home exhausted, fell asleep at the kitchen table, woke up before dawn to start again. James, only 15 at the time, became my partner in survival. He walked his siblings to school, made sure they did their homework, cooked dinner when I was too tired to stand. He gave up basketball, gave up his social life, gave up the carefree adolescence he deserved. I watched my oldest son become a man overnight, and I hated Richard for dying and leaving us with nothing. Now I hated him even more for being alive. Sarah had struggled differently. She was 12 when Richard died, old enough to understand death but young enough to still need her father desperately. She became withdrawn, anxious, terrified that I would leave her too. She slept in my bed for 2 years, unable to be alone. She had panic attacks before school, before tests, before any situation that felt uncertain. I took her to therapy when I could afford it, which was not often. I held her through the nightmares. I promised her, over and over, that I would never leave her. I kept that promise even when keeping it nearly broke me. Michael Jr. had been the most visibly damaged. At 10 years old, he did not have the emotional tools to process such profound loss. He acted out, got in fights, failed classes. By high school, he had discovered alcohol. By college, he had dropped out and was living with friends who were as lost as he was. I spent years trying to save him. I paid for rehab twice. I bailed him out of jail once. I held interventions that failed and watched relapses that devastated. Only in the last 3 years had he finally found stability, working as a chef, attending meetings, rebuilding his life one day at a time, all of it. Every struggle and sacrifice and sleepless night had been based on a lie. Richard had not died. He had chosen to leave. He had watched from a distance, or perhaps not watched at all, while his family fell apart without him. James came back inside after 30 minutes, his eyes red. He sat down heavily on the couch and stared at the floor. I have something to tell you, he said quietly. We all turned to look at him. There was something in his voice, something heavy with guilt, that made my stomach clench. James, what is it? He did not look at me. He could not seem to lift his eyes from the carpet. I knew, he said. I've known for 10 years that Dad was alive. The room went absolutely silent. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Michael Jr. made a sound like he had been punched. "What did you say?" I whispered. "I was on a business trip to San Diego in 2014. I saw him coming out of a restaurant. I followed him to his car. And when he turned around, James's voice broke. He recognized me immediately. He knew exactly who I was. You've known for 10 years. I could not process what I was hearing. You've known your father was alive for 10 years. And you never told me? He made me promise, Mom. He said if I told anyone, he would. James finally looked up, and I saw the anguish on his face. He said he would destroy you. He said there were things about the insurance money, about how you received it, that could send you to prison. He said if I kept quiet, he would make sure you were protected. Protected? Sarah's voice was incredulous. You call this protected? He gave me money, James continued. Each word pulled from him like a tooth. $200,000 to buy my house. He said it was his way of taking care of me, of making up for what he did, and I took it. I took his money and I kept his secret and I lied to all of you for 10 years. I stared at my eldest son, the child who had sacrificed his childhood to help me survive. The man I had trusted more than anyone else in the world. How could you? I asked. James had no answer. The silence in my living room was suffocating. Sarah had backed away from James as if he were a stranger. Michael Jr. sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking, and I stood in the middle of it all, feeling the foundations of my family crumble beneath my feet. 10 years, I said again. The words felt foreign in my mouth. You looked me in the eyes for 10 years, every Sunday dinner, every holiday. Every time I cried about missing your father, and you knew he was alive. Mom, please try to understand. Understand what? My voice rose, decades of suppressed grief and anger finally finding release. Understand that my own son watched me work myself to the bone while his father built a fortune in California? Understand that you let me visit that empty grave every single week while knowing it was a lie? James flinched as if I had struck him. I was trying to protect you. Protect me from what? The truth? From prison! James stood, his own anger flaring. Dad said the insurance payout was fraud. He said you could go to jail for collecting money on a death that never happened. He said if anyone found out, they would come after you, not him. And you believed him? You believed the man who abandoned his family to avoid gambling debts? James's face crumpled. I didn't know what to believe. I was 28 years old, Mom. I had just seen my dead father walking out of a restaurant. I wasn't thinking clearly. So you took his money instead. Sarah's voice was ice. $200,000 to keep your mouth shut. I took it for Linda and the kids. We were struggling. You know that. We couldn't afford the down payment on the house. Couldn't afford childcare. Couldn't afford... We all struggled, James. Michael Jr. finally looked up, his eyes red and furious. We all struggled because Dad left us with nothing, but the rest of us didn't get a secret cash payment to make it easier. That's not fair. Fair? Michael Jr. laughed bitterly. You want to talk about fair? Do you know how many times I almost died because I was trying to drink away the pain of losing Dad? Do you know how many nights Mom sat up with me in the hospital, holding my hand while I detoxed, crying because she thought she was going to lose me too? James had no response. He stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the family he had betrayed, and I could see him realizing for the first time the full weight of what he had done. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing would have been telling the truth. I sat down heavily on the couch, suddenly exhausted. The right thing would have been trusting your family instead of the man who abandoned us. What was I supposed to do? He's my father. He was your father, I corrected. The moment he chose to let us believe he was dead, he stopped being your father. He stopped being my husband. He became something else entirely. We sat in painful silence for a long while. The clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds. measuring time that suddenly felt meaningless. 23 years of grief. 10 years of lies, on top of lies. How do you recover from something like that? What happens now? Sarah asked finally. Do we go to San Diego? Do we confront him? I don't know. I looked at James. Is there anything else you haven't told us? Any other secrets you've been keeping? James hesitated, and my heart sank. His mother knows, he said quietly. Grandma Barbara. She's known since the beginning. She helped him disappear. If James's confession had been a blow, this was a knockout punch. Barbara Mitchell. My mother-in-law. The woman who had comforted me at Richard's funeral, who had helped me with the children when I was overwhelmed, who had been part of our lives for 40 years. She had known. She had watched me grieve for her son, and she had known the whole time. I visited her last month, I said numbly. I brought her flowers for her birthday. She held my hands and told me Richard would have been so proud of the life I built. Mom, she looked me in the eyes and lied. Just like you did. Just like Richard did. I felt something inside me harden, a protective shell forming around what remained of my heart. Is there anyone else? Anyone else who knew my husband was alive while I spent 23 years as a widow? James shook his head. Just me, Grandma, and whoever helped Dad set up his new identity. I don't know who else was involved. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ordinary street where I had raised my children, where I had built a life from the wreckage of Richard's abandonment. The neighbors were going about their evening routines, walking dogs, watering lawns, living the kind of simple existence I had once hoped for. We're going to San Diego, I said without turning around. All of us. We're going to look Richard in the face and make him answer for what he did. And then what? Michael Jr. asked. I thought about the insurance money, about the fraud implications James had mentioned. I thought about Barbara's betrayal, about the web of lies that had ensnared my entire family. I thought about the man who had promised to love me forever and then erased me from his life as if I had never existed. Then we get justice, I said. Whatever that looks like. Sarah stood and put her hand on my shoulder. I'm with you, Mom. Michael Jr. rose as well. So am I. We all looked at James. He stood apart from us, isolated by his decade of deception. But he was still my son, still the boy who had given up his childhood to help me survive. I'm sorry, he said again. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I nodded slowly. Then we leave tomorrow. Before we left for San Diego, I needed to understand exactly what James had been protecting me from. We sat together at my kitchen table the next morning, the rest of the family still asleep, and he told me everything. It was October 2014, James began, his voice hollow. I was in San Diego for a software conference. The last night, some colleagues wanted to try this Mexican restaurant everyone was talking about, Santos Family Kitchen. He paused, staring at his coffee cup as if it held answers. We were waiting for a table when I saw him come out of the kitchen. He was talking to a waiter, laughing about something. I knew him immediately. Mom, even with the beard, even with the gray hair, even after 13 years. I knew my own father. What did you do? I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My colleagues were talking to me, and I couldn't hear a word they said. I just watched him walk through the restaurant, shake hands with customers, disappear into an office in the back. James's hands trembled around his mug. I made up some excuse and left. I sat in my rental car for an hour, trying to convince myself I was wrong. But you weren't wrong. No. I came back the next morning and waited outside. When he left for the day, I followed him to a house in La Jolla. A beautiful house, Mom. Ocean view. Expensive cars in the driveway. A woman came out to meet him, and he kissed her like. James trailed off, like he used to kiss me. James nodded miserably. I confronted him in the parking lot of a grocery store 2 days later. He was loading bags into his car when I walked up and said, "Hello, Dad." I tried to imagine that moment. My eldest son, face to face with the father he had mourned for 13 years. The shock, the confusion, the rage that must have consumed him. What did he say? He went white. For a second I thought he might have a heart attack right there. James laughed bitterly. Wouldn't that have been ironic? Actually dying after spending years pretending to be dead. James. Sorry. He rubbed his eyes. He asked me to get in his car. Said he would explain everything if I just gave him a chance. I shouldn't have agreed, but I needed to understand. I needed to know why. And what did he tell you? James recounted the conversation, and I listened with growing horror. Richard had explained about the gambling addiction, the mounting debts, the threats against our family. He had described Frank DeLuca as a monster who would have hurt us to send a message. He had painted himself as a tragic hero, sacrificing his own life to protect the people he loved. He said the only way to keep us safe was to disappear completely. James continued. He said Frank would only leave us alone if he believed Richard was dead and the insurance money had been paid. He said it was the hardest thing he ever did, letting us think he was gone. That's a beautiful story, I said coldly. Did he mention the part where he started a new family? Where he built a restaurant empire? Where he lived in luxury while we struggled to survive? James winced. I asked him about that. He said the new life was necessary for the cover. He said he couldn't risk any connection to Boston or anyone might figure out the truth. And Maria? His wife? His 2 children? Were they necessary for the cover too? Mom, he could have sent money anonymously. He could have found ways to help us without revealing himself. Instead, he gave everything to his new family and left us with nothing. I stood and walked to the window. He didn't sacrifice himself for us. James. He escaped. He ran away from his debts and his responsibilities, and he never looked back. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's more." I turned around. More? Dad said the insurance payout was technically fraud. He said you collected $500,000 for a death that didn't happen. He said if anyone ever found out, you would be the one facing criminal charges. Not him. James's voice dropped to a whisper. He said he had documentation proving you knew the death was staged. Forged letters, doctored bank records, things that would make it look like you were complicit. The room seemed to tilt. That's a lie. I had no idea he was alive. I know that, Mom. But he showed me the documents. They looked real. He said if I ever told anyone the truth, he would release them. He said you would go to prison and lose everything. I sat back down, my legs unable to support me. Richard had not just abandoned us. He had built a trap, a cage of fabricated evidence designed to keep us silent forever. The $200,000, I said. Was that part of the deal? James nodded, shame written across his face. He said it was guilt money. He said he wanted to help his grandchildren, even if he couldn't be part of their lives. I told him I didn't want it, but Linda was pregnant with our second child and we were drowning in debt and... He broke off, tears streaming down his cheeks. I took it. I took his money, and I kept his secret. And I've hated myself every day since. I looked at my son, this man who had been forced into an impossible choice by the father who should have protected him. I wanted to be angry. I was angry. But I was also heartbroken. He manipulated you, I said finally. Just like he manipulated me. Just like he manipulated everyone who ever trusted him. I should have been stronger. Maybe. But you were also alone, facing something impossible. I reached across the table and took his hand. We'll figure this out together. All of us. Whatever Richard has planned, whatever traps he's laid, we'll face them as a family. James squeezed my hand, and I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. Thank you, Mom. Don't thank me yet, I said. We still have to get through San Diego. We flew out of Boston Logan on a gray Thursday morning, 4 people bound together by blood and betrayal. Sarah sat beside me, her hand occasionally reaching for mine. when the turbulence of our emotions matched the turbulence of the plane. James and Michael Jr. sat in the row behind us, speaking in low voices that I could not quite hear. I had not slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's face on that television screen, smiling and confident, accepting an award for a life built on our suffering. I saw the journal entries documenting his decision to abandon us. I saw James's face as he confessed to 10 years of silence, 23 years of grief, 10 years of lies. And now, finally, the truth. The flight was 5.5 hours. Enough time to think and overthink every possible outcome. What would I say when I saw Richard? What would he say? Would he beg for forgiveness? Or double down on his justifications? Would he even acknowledge what he had done? I had rehearsed speeches in my head 1,000 times since seeing that news segment. Accusations, demands for explanations, years of suppressed rage finally given voice. But every script felt inadequate. How do you find words for a betrayal this profound? Sarah interrupted my thoughts. Mom, I need to tell you something. I turned to look at her. She was staring straight ahead, her jaw tight with tension. I called ahead, she continued. I found the restaurant's phone number and I called. I asked to speak with Robert Santos, and when they said he wasn't available, I left a message. My stomach dropped. What kind of message? I said I was a reporter doing a story on successful immigrant entrepreneurs. I said I wanted to interview him about his journey from nothing to restaurant empire. Sarah finally looked at me. I made an appointment for tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Sarah, I know, I should have asked first. But I didn't want to give him a chance to run. If he gets any warning that we're coming, he might disappear again. Her eyes hardened. I'm not letting him disappear again. I processed this information slowly. Part of me was angry that Sarah had acted without consulting me. But a larger part was grateful. She was right. If Richard suspected we knew the truth, he might vanish before we could confront him. What name did you give? Sarah Brooks. I used my married name. She smiled grimly. He won't recognize it. He never met my husband. He wasn't there for my wedding. We landed in San Diego in the early afternoon. The contrast with Boston was immediate and jarring. Where we had left gray skies and lingering winter chill, we arrived to sunshine and palm trees and the salt smell of the ocean. It was beautiful, and I hated it. James had booked us rooms at a hotel in the Gaslamp Quarter, close to the original Santos family kitchen location. We checked in separately, using cash, taking precautions that felt paranoid but necessary. Richard had already proven himself capable of deception on a grand scale. We could not afford to underestimate him. That evening, we gathered in my room to finalize our plan. Sarah had printed out everything we knew about Richard's new life: addresses, business locations, family photographs, interview quotes. She spread the papers across the bed like evidence at a trial. The flagship restaurant is here, she said, pointing to a map. That's where I scheduled the interview. His house is in La Jolla, about 20 minutes north. According to his social media, his wife Maria manages the catering side of the business. And his kids are both in college. What do we actually know about Maria? Michael Jr. asked. Does she know who he really is? That's what we need to find out, I said. James, what did Dad tell you about her? James shifted uncomfortably. He said they met in 2003, a couple years after he arrived in California. She was working as a hostess at a restaurant he frequented. He said she believed his story about being divorced and starting over, so she might not know anything about us. Or she knows everything and has been helping him hide, Sarah countered. We can't assume she's innocent. I looked at the photograph of Maria Santos, a handsome woman with kind eyes and an easy smile. She was holding hands with Richard in front of their restaurant, a picture of domestic happiness. Either she was an accomplice in my husband's deception, or she was another victim. Either way, her life was about to be destroyed. What about the kids? Michael Jr. asked quietly. Carlos and Isabella. They didn't choose this. They didn't do anything wrong. The question hung in the air. Richard's new children were roughly the same age as our children had been when he abandoned us. They had grown up with a father who attended their games and helped with their homework and told them he loved them every day. They had no idea that their existence was built on the ruins of another family's happiness. "We'll try to be careful with them," I said finally. "But they deserve to know the truth too. Everyone deserves the truth." We ordered room service and ate in near silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Tomorrow I would see my husband for the first time in 23 years. Tomorrow I would look into the eyes of the man who had let me grieve for him while he built a new life in the sunshine. I did not know what I would feel. Rage, certainly. Pain, undoubtedly. But beyond that, the emotions were too tangled to separate. As I tried to sleep that night, I found myself thinking about the woman I had been before Richard's death. Younger, softer, still believing in the fundamental goodness of the people she loved. That woman had been buried alongside Richard's empty coffin. The woman who would face him tomorrow was someone different entirely. Harder, stronger, forged in the fire of 23 years of survival. Richard Mitchell had no idea what was coming. The Santos family kitchen was everything Richard had never given us. Warm lighting, exposed brick walls, the smell of authentic Mexican spices filling the air. Photographs lined the entrance, showing the restaurant's growth from a single storefront to a 12-location empire. In every picture, Robert Santos smiled beside his beautiful wife and his two beautiful children. I stood outside for 10 minutes, unable to move. Sarah had gone in first, checking the layout and confirming that Robert was indeed on the premises. James and Michael Jr. waited in a coffee shop across the street, ready to join us if needed. "Mom." Sarah appeared at my elbow. "He's in his office. The hostess says he'll be out in 5 minutes for the interview." 5 minutes. After 23 years, I was 5 minutes away from facing my husband. I followed Sarah inside. The lunch crowd was beginning to thin, but the restaurant still buzzed with conversation and the clatter of dishes. We were shown to a private table near the back, where Sarah had arranged for the interview to take place. I sat with my back to the kitchen, unable to bear the thought of seeing Richard before I was ready. "Mrs. Brooks?" A woman's voice, warm and professional. "I'm Maria Santos. My husband will be with you shortly. Can I offer you something to drink while you wait?" I turned and found myself face to face with Richard's new wife. Maria Santos was elegant in a way that spoke of natural grace rather than expensive effort. She wore simple jewelry, minimal makeup, and a genuine smile that reached her eyes. She looked like the kind of woman who baked cookies for her neighbors and remembered everyone's birthdays. She looked nothing like a villain. "Water would be lovely," I managed. "Thank you." Maria nodded and turned to Sarah. "And for you?" "The same, please." As Maria walked away, I felt something shift in my chest. I had prepared myself to hate this woman, this interloper who had stolen my husband and built a life on my grief. But hatred requires certainty, and I was no longer certain of anything. "She doesn't know," Sarah whispered. "Look at her, Mom. She has no idea who we are." I watched Maria interact with staff and customers, moving through the restaurant with the ease of someone who belonged there. She touched a waiter's shoulder encouragingly. She laughed at something a regular customer said. She checked on a table of elderly women with the same attentiveness she had shown us. She was a good person. I could see it in every gesture, every interaction. And that made everything infinitely more complicated. Here we are. Maria returned with our waters, setting them down with care. "Robert should be just another minute. He's very excited about the interview. He loves talking about the restaurant's history." "I'm sure he does," I said quietly. Maria tilted her head, perhaps sensing something in my tone. But before she could respond, a door opened behind me, and I heard a voice I had not heard in 23 years. "Mrs. Brooks? I'm Robert Santos. It's a pleasure to meet you." I did not turn around immediately. I could not. The voice was older, slightly rougher, but, unmistakably, Richard's. The same cadence, The same warmth. The same practiced charm that had made me fall in love with him 4 decades ago. Mrs. Brooks? I took a breath and turned to face my husband. He had aged, of course. The thick dark hair I remembered was now completely gray, and a neatly trimmed beard covered the jaw I had once traced with my fingers. He had gained weight, settled into the comfortable prosperity of his new life. But his eyes were the same. Those pale blue eyes that had looked into mine on our wedding day, that had watched our children being born, that had been full of tears at his mother's funeral. Those eyes that had lied to me for our entire marriage. Recognition came slowly. He extended his hand for a handshake, his smile fixed in place. Then something flickered across his face. Confusion, uncertainty, and finally, dawning horror. "Eleanor?" he breathed. Maria looked between us, frowning. "Robert? Do you know this woman?" I stood slowly, drawing myself up to my full height. 23 years of grief and rage and survival crystallized into this single moment. "Hello, Richard," I said. "It's been a long time." The color drained from his face. He took a step backward, bumping into a table and nearly knocking over a glass. His carefully constructed world was crumbling before his eyes, and I felt a savage satisfaction at watching it happen. "I don't understand," Maria said, her voice rising. "Robert, what's going on? Who is this woman? Why did she call you Richard?" Richard did not answer. He could not seem to form words. He stared at me like I was a ghost, which I suppose I was. The ghost of a life he had killed and buried 23 years ago. "My name is Eleanor Mitchell," I said, turning to Maria. "And I'm very sorry to have to tell you this, but your husband is not who he claims to be. His real name is Richard Mitchell. He's from Boston, and until 23 years ago, he was married to me." Maria's face went white. "That's impossible. Robert told me. His first wife died in childbirth." He said. "He lied." I pulled out my phone and showed her a photograph of Richard and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful and completely unaware of the future. He lied about everything, and we both deserved to know why. Maria looked at the photograph, then at Richard, then back at the photograph. Her hands began to shake. "Robert?" she whispered. "Tell me this isn't true." Richard finally found his voice. But instead of answering his wife, he turned and ran. James and Michael Jr. caught Richard in the parking lot. They had seen him sprint out the back entrance and intercepted him before he could reach his car. By the time Sarah and I emerged from the restaurant, my 3 children had their father cornered against a Mercedes SUV that probably cost more than I had earned in 5 years of nursing. Richard looked like a trapped animal. His eyes darted between his children, searching for escape routes that did not exist. The confident businessman who had accepted awards and charmed customers was gone, replaced by a desperate man watching his carefully constructed life collapse. "You can't do this," he said. "You don't understand what you're doing." "Then explain it to us," James said. His voice was calm, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the anger he was barely containing. "Explain why you let us think you were dead for 23 years. It's complicated, then uncomplicate it." Michael Jr. stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. "You owe us that much, Dad. You owe us an explanation." Maria emerged from the restaurant behind us, her face streaked with tears. She had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. She stood apart from both families, belonging to neither. A woman caught between 2 versions of a man she thought she knew. "Robert." Her voice cracked on the name. "Or Richard. Or whoever you are. Is it true? Did you have another family? Did you fake your death?" Richard closed his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Yes," he whispered. "It's true. All of it." Maria made a sound like a wounded animal. She leaned against the wall of the restaurant, unable to support her own weight. Sarah moved toward her instinctively, one victim reaching out to comfort another. "I was in trouble," Richard continued, his voice hollow. I owed money to dangerous people. Almost $1 million in gambling debts. They threatened to hurt Eleanor, hurt the kids if I didn't pay. I couldn't pay. I had nothing left. So you decided dying was easier than facing the consequences, I said. I decided dying was the only way to keep you safe. Richard's eyes flashed with something that might have been genuine emotion. Frank DeLuca would have killed you, Eleanor. He would have hurt our children. The only way to make him stop was to make him believe I was dead and that the insurance money had settled the debt. The insurance money went to me, Richard. Not to Frank DeLuca. I know. Frank got his payment another way. Richard glanced away. My mother. She took out a second mortgage on her house, sold her jewelry, liquidated everything she had. She paid Frank to leave you alone. And then she helped me disappear. Barbara, my mother-in-law, who had held me at Richard's funeral and promised to always be there for me. She had known from the beginning. She had sacrificed her own financial security to protect the son who was too cowardly to protect himself. And then what? James asked. You just started over? New name? New city? New family? It wasn't that simple. Richard ran a hand through his gray hair. I spent 2 years working under the table, saving money, building a new identity. When I met Maria, I saw a chance at the life I had always wanted. A fresh start. A clean slate. You already had a life, I said quietly. You had a wife who loved you. 3 children who needed you. A home that was waiting for you every night. I know. Richard's voice broke. I know what I threw away. I've thought about it every day for 23 years, but not enough to come back. Not enough to tell us the truth. I couldn't. The longer I stayed away, the harder it became. And then James found me, and I panicked. He looked at his eldest son with something like shame. I threatened him. I bribed him. I did everything I could to keep my secret, and I hate myself for it. Maria had been listening in silence, her face a mask of devastation. Now she stepped forward. You told me your first wife died, she said. You told me you lost a child in that pregnancy. You told me you came to California to escape the grief. Her voice rose with each sentence. Was any of it true? Was anything you ever told me true? I loved you. Richard said. That was true. I love our children. That's true. You don't know what love means. Maria's voice turned cold. Love doesn't build itself on lies. Love doesn't erase the people it hurts. She turned to me, and I saw something unexpected in her eyes. Solidarity. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. If I had known. You couldn't have known, I said. He lied to both of us. I need to call my children. Maria pulled out her phone with shaking hands. They need to hear this from me before it gets out. She looked at Richard with an expression of pure disgust. Don't come home tonight. Don't come home ever. Whatever we had, it's over. She walked away, leaving Richard alone with the family he had abandoned. Eleanor, please. Richard reached toward me, then stopped when he saw my expression. I never stopped loving you. I never stopped thinking about our children. Everything I did to protect you. No, I said. Everything you did to protect yourself. You were a coward 23 years ago, and you're a coward now. I turned my back on my husband and walked away. After a moment, my children followed. Behind us, Richard Mitchell stood alone in the parking lot of his empire, watching everything he had built crumble to dust. We returned to Boston 3 days later, carrying evidence and exhaustion in equal measure. The confrontation with Richard had given us answers, but not closure. There were still loose ends to tie up, still truths to uncover, still the matter of the insurance fraud hanging over my head like a sword. Sarah had been researching during our time in San Diego. She had tracked down Dr. Samuel Hayes, the coroner who had signed Richard's death certificate 23 years ago. According to public records, he had retired from the medical examiner's office in 2015 and now lived in a nursing home in Worcester, suffering from terminal pancreatic cancer. He's dying, Sarah told me on the flight home. The hospice says he has maybe a month left. If we want to talk to him, it has to be now. I did not want to talk to him. I did not want to know how much he had been paid to lie, how easily he had signed away the truth, but I needed his testimony if I was going to protect myself from the fraud charges Richard had threatened. The nursing home was a modest facility, clean but institutional. Dr. Hayes had a private room overlooking a small garden where late autumn flowers struggled against the approaching winter. He was propped up in bed when we arrived, his body wasted by disease, his eyes sharp with awareness of how little time remained. "Mrs. Mitchell." His voice was a papery whisper. "I've been wondering when you would come." I sat in the chair beside his bed. Sarah stood near the door, ready to record the conversation on her phone. "You know why I'm here." "I do." Dr. Hayes closed his eyes briefly. "I've thought about you often over the years. About your children. About what I helped take from you. Then tell me. Tell me everything." He did. The confession poured out of him like poison being drained from a wound. 23 years of guilt, finally finding release. Richard had approached him 2 months before the staged accident. They had known each other slightly, having crossed paths at various professional functions. Richard had learned that Dr. Hayes was in financial trouble, struggling to pay for his daughter's medical treatments for a rare autoimmune disease. "He offered me $50,000, Dr. Hayes said. Cash. No questions asked. All I had to do was sign a death certificate for a body that didn't exist. How is that even possible? Didn't anyone verify the remains? The accident was designed to leave minimal evidence. A car fire in a remote ravine, discovered hours after the crash. By the time the wreck was recovered, there was nothing left but bones and dental fragments. Dr. Hayes coughed, a wet sound that spoke of his approaching end. Richard provided dental records that matched a John Doe from the morgue, a homeless man who had died of exposure the week before, with no family to claim him. I felt sick. Richard had not just faked his own death. He had stolen a dead man's identity, desecrated a stranger's remains, all to cover his escape. The funeral home received a sealed casket with instructions not to open it, Dr. Hayes continued. I told them the family had requested no viewing, due to the condition of the body. Everyone believed me because I was the coroner. My word was official, and you've kept this secret for 23 years. I have. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. I told myself I did it for my daughter. She needed those treatments. And our insurance had been exhausted. The money Richard gave me kept her alive long enough for new therapies to be developed. She's 45 now. Healthy. With children of her own. So you saved your daughter by destroying my family. Dr. Hayes flinched at the words. But he did not deny them. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mrs. Mitchell. I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I've prepared a full written confession. He gestured weakly toward a folder on his nightstand. It's notarized and witnessed. It confirms that Richard Mitchell is alive and that I falsified his death certificate in exchange for payment. It also confirms that you had no knowledge of the deception. I picked up the folder and opened it. Inside was a detailed statement, exactly as he had described. At the bottom was Dr. Hayes's signature, shaky but legible, witnessed by 2 hospice nurses. Why now? I asked. After all these years, why confess? Because I'm dying. And I'm tired of carrying this weight. Dr. Hayes met my eyes with an expression of profound weariness. Because my daughter is secure now, and the truth can't hurt her anymore, and because you deserve to know that someone, at least, is sorry for what was done to you. I sat with him for another hour, listening as he filled in details I had not known to ask about. The planning that had gone into Richard's disappearance, the connections he had used to establish his new identity, the network of lies that had allowed a dead man to walk among the living for more than 2 decades. When I finally left, I carried the confession with me, a weapon, against the fraud charges Richard had threatened. Dr. Hayes would likely be dead before any legal proceedings could take place, but his testimony would live on in the document he had prepared. "Mom?" Sarah asked as we walked to the car. "Are you okay?" I thought about the question for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "I'm not okay. But I'm going to be." The truth was finally coming out. And with it, the first fragile shoots of something that might, eventually, become healing. Richard came to Boston a week later. He showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening, uninvited and unwelcome, looking like a man who had lost everything. Which, I supposed, he had. Maria had filed for divorce the day after our confrontation. His children, Carlos and Isabella, had refused to speak to him once they learned the truth. The restaurant empire he had built was crumbling under the weight of scandal, as news of his true identity spread through San Diego's business community. The award-winning entrepreneur was now a pariah. Part of me felt satisfaction at his downfall. A larger part felt nothing at all. Eleanor. He stood on my porch in the same spot where I had received news of his death 23 years ago. "Please, I need to talk to you. There's nothing left to say. There's everything left to say." His voice cracked. "I've made terrible mistakes. I've hurt everyone I ever loved. But I'm still your husband. We're still married." The words hit me like a slap. He was right. In the eyes of the law, we had never divorced. My widowhood had been a fiction, which meant our marriage was still technically valid. I had been another man's wife for 45 years. Even during the 23 years I thought he was dead. "You stopped being my husband the moment you chose to let me grieve," I said coldly. "You stopped being my husband when you built a new family on the ashes of ours. I know. I know what I did was unforgivable." Richard reached toward me, then stopped when he saw my expression. "But I'm begging you, Eleanor. Give me a chance to explain. Give me a chance to make things right." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him in. We sat in the living room, the same room where I had seen his face on television, where I had told our children their father was alive, where so many of the worst moments of recent months had unfolded. Richard looked around at the photographs on the walls, the furniture we had chosen together decades ago, the life I had maintained in his absence. "You kept everything," he said quietly. "It looks exactly the same as when I left. I couldn't afford to change it. I was too busy working double shifts to keep our children fed." The accusation landed. Richard closed his eyes. "I want you to understand why I did what I did," he began. "Not to excuse it. I know there's no excuse. But I need you to understand the fear I felt, the desperation. Then explain." He told me about the gambling addiction that had consumed him in his late 30s. The thrill of the casino, the certainty that the next bet would be the winner, the spiral of debt that grew faster than he could comprehend. He had hidden it from me for years, taking out secret loans, maxing out credit cards I did not know existed, borrowing from increasingly dangerous sources. Frank DeLuca wasn't just a loan shark, Richard said. He was connected to organized crime. When I couldn't pay, he didn't threaten to break my legs. He threatened to break yours. He threatened to hurt James, Sarah, Michael. He showed me photographs of our house, of the kids' schools. He knew everything about our family, so you chose to run instead of fight. I chose to protect you the only way I knew how. Richard's voice rose with desperation. If I had stayed, if I had tried to pay him off or go to the police, he would have retaliated. You would have been caught in the crossfire. Our children would have been targets. And your mother? Barbara? She knew everything? Richard nodded miserably. She's the one who suggested faking my death. She mortgaged her house to pay Frank enough to walk away. She helped me establish a new identity. She's protected the secret all these years because she believed she was protecting you. I need to talk to her. She's flying in tomorrow. She wants to explain herself. To apologize. Richard paused. She's 88 years old, Eleanor. Whatever anger you feel toward her, please remember that she did what she did out of love. Love doesn't lie for 23 years. No, it doesn't. Richard leaned forward. But sometimes, love makes terrible choices. Sometimes, love convinces itself that the wrong thing is the right thing. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to take me back. I'm just asking you to understand that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. I looked at the man I had married, the father of my children, the ghost who had haunted my life for more than 2 decades. I saw the lines on his face, the gray in his hair, the weight of guilt in his eyes. I saw the man he had been and the man he had become, and I felt nothing but cold clarity. You want forgiveness? I stood, looking down at him. Forgiveness is earned, Richard. It doesn't come from explanations or apologies or tearful confessions. It comes from actions, from making amends, from facing the consequences of what you've done. Tell me what to do. I'll do anything. First, you'll face the legal consequences of insurance fraud. Dr. Hayes gave me his confession before he died, which protects me from prosecution. But you, Richard, you collected life insurance on a death that never happened. You bribed a coroner. You committed identity fraud. Those are crimes. Richard's face went pale. Eleanor. Second, you'll compensate our children for the years of suffering you caused them. Not with dirty money from your restaurant empire, with real accountability. Therapy bills. Lost opportunities. The childhood they never got to have. I will. I promise. And third, I walked to the door and opened it. You'll leave this house and never come back. Whatever legal proceedings need to happen, they'll happen through lawyers. I don't want to see your face again. Richard stood slowly. His shoulders slumped in defeat. At the door, he paused. I'm sorry, Eleanor. For everything. So am I said. Now go. Barbara Mitchell arrived the next morning, looking every one of her 88 years. She moved slowly, supported by a cane, her once sharp eyes clouded with age and what I recognized as genuine fear. This was not the formidable woman who had ruled family gatherings with an iron will. This was an old woman, coming to face judgment for decisions made decades ago. I met her on the porch. I did not invite her inside. Eleanor. Her voice trembled. Thank you for seeing me. I didn't do it for you. I did it because I need to understand how a woman I trusted could watch me suffer for 23 years and say nothing. Barbara lowered herself onto the porch swing, the same swing where Richard and I had sat on summer evenings, watching our children play in the yard. The memory felt like a knife. I know you hate me, she said. I've hated myself for years. But I need you to hear my side of the story before you make your final judgment. I leaned against the railing, arms crossed. Then, talk. Barbara had known about Richard's gambling problem before I did. She had bailed him out twice in his 20s, paying off debts that he swore would never happen again. When the problem resurfaced in his late 30s, she had hoped it was a phase, something he would outgrow. I was wrong, she admitted. By the time I realized how serious it was, he was already in too deep. Frank DeLuca had his hooks in Richard, and there was no easy way out. So faking his death was your idea. It was the only option that kept everyone safe. Barbara's hands shook as she gripped her cane. Frank made it clear that Richard's debt would be collected one way or another. If Richard couldn't pay, his family would. You, the children, everyone he loved. And you believed that staging a death would make it all go away? I believed that giving Frank a final payment, along with proof that Richard was dead and couldn't cause any more trouble, would be enough to close the account. Barbara's eyes met mine. I was right. After the funeral, Frank never contacted any of you. He considered the matter settled. How much did you pay him? $300,000. Everything I had. My house, my savings, my retirement. I spent the next 10 years paying off the mortgage I had to take out. Barbara laughed bitterly. Richard always said I was a good mother. I suppose I was. Good enough to bankrupt myself to save a son who didn't deserve saving. I processed this information slowly. Barbara had sacrificed her financial security to protect Richard from the consequences of his own choices. She had done it out of love. The same blind love that had led me to ignore the warning signs of Richard's addiction. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. After the funeral, after Richard was safely away, why didn't you tell me the truth? Because I was afraid. Barbara's voice broke. Afraid you would go to the police. Afraid you would try to find Richard and bring him back, which would put everyone in danger again. Afraid that knowing the truth would hurt you more than believing the lie. You don't get to make that decision for me. You don't get to decide what truth I can handle. I know that now. I knew it then too, deep down. But I was a coward, Eleanor. I chose the easy path, the one that let me sleep at night. And I've regretted it every day since. We sat in silence for a long moment. A car drove past, its driver oblivious to the decades of betrayal being unpacked on this ordinary porch. There's something else you should know, Barbara said finally. Something Richard doesn't know I'm telling you. I waited. The night before Richard staged the accident, I told him not to do it. I told him there had to be another way, that running would only make things worse. We argued for hours. Barbara's eyes filled with tears. He said he couldn't face you. He said he couldn't look at the children knowing what he had done, what he had risked. He said dying was easier than admitting the truth. That sounds like Richard. He was always weak, Eleanor. Even as a boy, he ran from problems instead of facing them. I tried to teach him responsibility, tried to show him that real men stand and fight, but he never learned. Barbara reached out and touched my hand. You deserve better than my son. You deserved a man who would face his demons instead of abandoning the people who loved him. I looked at this old woman, this mother who had loved her son too much and in all the wrong ways. I saw the guilt that had eaten at her for 23 years, the weight of secrets that had aged her beyond her years. I saw a woman who had made terrible choices for what she believed were the right reasons. I did not forgive her. I was not sure I ever would. But I understood her. And that was perhaps more important. What happens now? Barbara asked. Now Richard faces the consequences of what he did. Insurance fraud, identity theft, bribery. The law will decide his punishment. I paused. As for you, Barbara, that's not my decision to make. You'll have to live with what you did. That's punishment enough for anyone. Barbara nodded slowly, accepting the verdict. She rose with difficulty, leaning heavily on her cane. For what it's worth, she said, I'm proud of the woman you became, the way you raised those children, the strength you showed. Richard threw away something precious when he left you. I know, I said. I've always known. I watched her walk to the waiting car, where Richard sat behind the wheel. He looked at me through the window, his face a mask of regret. I turned and went inside without waving goodbye. The fallout spread like wildfire through both families, burning everything it touched. In San Diego, Maria Santos filed for divorce and full custody of their children. Carlos and Isabella, learning that their entire lives had been built on lies, retreated into shock and anger. Carlos dropped out of college mid-semester, unable to focus. Isabella refused to leave her room for 3 days. Neither would speak to Richard, the father they had loved and trusted, the man who had turned out to be a stranger. I learned this from Maria herself. She had begun calling me every few days. Two women bonded by the devastation of a single man's deception. Our conversations were awkward at first, filled with silences and unspoken resentments, but gradually, they became something else. Understanding, solidarity, the beginning of an unlikely friendship. My children don't know who they are anymore, Maria told me during one late-night call. Their whole identity was built around being Santos. Now they find out they're half Mitchell, that they have siblings they never knew existed, that their father is a criminal who abandoned his first family. Her voice cracked. How do you help children recover from something like that? You love them. I said. You tell them the truth. You give them time. Is that what you did with your children? I thought about James, Sarah, and Michael Jr. The revelation of their father's survival had torn open wounds they thought had healed long ago. Each of them was processing the betrayal in their own way. James carried the heaviest burden. His 10 years of silence had made him complicit in Richard's deception, and his siblings were struggling to forgive him. Sarah had stopped speaking to him entirely. Michael Jr. oscillated between rage and despair, showing up at my house at odd hours, needing to talk but unable to find words. James made a choice, Sarah said during one of our family dinners, the first since the truth came out. He chose Dad's money over our family. He let Mom suffer for 10 years when he could have ended it. I was trying to protect her, James said miserably. You were trying to protect yourself. Michael Jr.'s voice was cold. You took $200,000 to keep your mouth shut. That's not protection. That's a payoff. Enough. I set down my fork. What James did was wrong. He knows it. He's living with it. But tearing each other apart won't fix anything. Then what will? Sarah demanded. How do we go back to being a family after this? We don't go back. We go forward. I looked at each of my children, seeing the pain and anger and confusion in their eyes. Your father betrayed all of us. James made a terrible mistake, but we're still family. We can either let Richard's lies destroy us, or we can choose to survive them together. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Then Michael Jr. reached across the table and took James's hand. I'm still angry, he said quietly. I might be angry for a long time, but you're my brother, and I don't want to lose you too. Sarah watched this exchange with tears in her eyes. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. I can't forgive you yet, she told James. But I'm willing to try. It was not reconciliation. Not yet. But it was a start. Meanwhile, the legal consequences began to unfold. I had hired an attorney, Rachel Torres, who specialized in fraud cases. She reviewed Dr. Hayes's confession, Richard's journal, and all the evidence we had gathered. Her conclusion was clear. Richard had committed multiple felonies, including insurance fraud, identity theft, and bribery. The good news is that you're protected, Rachel told me. The coroner's confession, combined with Richard's own documentation of his plans, makes it clear you had no knowledge of the deception. No prosecutor would touch you. And Richard? That's where it gets complicated. Rachel spread documents across her desk. He committed these crimes in Massachusetts, but he's been living in California for 20 years. We're dealing with multiple jurisdictions, statute of limitations issues, and the question of whether the insurance company wants to pursue charges. They paid out $500,000 for a death that never happened. Of course they'll want to pursue charges. You'd be surprised. Sometimes companies prefer quiet settlements to public trials. The publicity could be damaging to their brand. Rachel paused. There's also the matter of your claim. If Richard is convicted of fraud, technically you received the proceeds of that fraud. I didn't know he was alive. I was a victim. I know. And I'll make sure the court knows it too. Rachel leaned forward. But you should be prepared for the possibility that you might have to return some or all of that money. The insurance company could argue that you've been unjustly enriched. $500,000. Money I had used to pay off the mortgage, to put 3 children through college, to survive 23 years as a single mother, money that had been the only good thing to come from Richard's supposed death. And now they might take it back. I drove home in a daze, trying to process the latest blow in a seemingly endless series of blows. My entire life had been upended by Richard's reappearance, and the aftershocks showed no signs of stopping. That night, I sat in my dark living room, looking at the wedding photograph I had kept on the mantel for 45 years. The young couple smiled at the camera, full of hope and promise, completely unaware of the devastation that awaited them. I picked up the frame and carried it to the garage, where I placed it in a box marked Donate. Then I went back inside and started removing every photograph of Richard from the walls. It was time to stop living in the past. Detective Maria Reyes called me on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I had boxed up Richard's photographs and donated our wedding album to Goodwill. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, her voice professional but not unkind. "The district attorney's office has officially opened a criminal investigation into your husband's," she paused, correcting herself, "into Richard Mitchell's staged death and subsequent fraud. I wanted you to hear it from me before the news breaks." I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where my children had eaten cereal before school, where I had balanced checkbooks at midnight after double shifts, where James had finally confessed his decade of silence. What happens now? We've obtained warrants for his financial records going back to 1998. The insurance company is cooperating fully. They want their money back. But more than that, they want him prosecuted. Makes for good press. There was a hint of cynicism in her voice. We've also issued a warrant for his arrest. San Diego PD is coordinating with us. He'll run, I said quietly. That's what he does. We're aware of his history. His passport has been flagged. We've frozen the assets. We can reach the restaurant. The La Jolla property. His wife, his current wife, has been remarkably cooperative. Maria Santos. I thought of her face when the truth had finally broken through Richard's carefully constructed lies. The devastation in her eyes had mirrored my own from 23 years ago, except she'd been mourning a living man while I'd been mourning a dead one. In some ways, her grief was worse. At least my Richard had been frozen in time, preserved in memory as the man I loved. Hers was transforming before her eyes into someone she'd never known at all. She's filing for divorce, I said. Yes. She's also provided us with access to his personal files. Apparently, he kept meticulous records. Old habit from his business days, I suppose. There are documents going back decades. Bank statements from accounts you never knew existed. Communications with Frank DeLuca. Even a journal. My breath caught. A journal? Sporadic entries. Mostly from the years immediately after his disappearance. He wrote about missing his children. Missing you. Detective Reyes paused. I'm telling you this because you'll likely hear it during the trial. His defense will probably use it to paint him as a tortured man who made impossible choices. I wanted you to be prepared. I laughed, and the sound surprised me, bitter and sharp. He wrote about missing us while he built a new life with a new wife and new children. While my son James delivered pizzas to pay for community college. While my daughter Sarah had panic attacks so severe she couldn't leave the house for a year. While Michael Jr. nearly destroyed himself with alcohol. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. He can keep his journal. There's something else. Dr. Samuel Hayes passed away yesterday. Peacefully, according to the hospice. But his confession has been entered into evidence. It corroborates everything, the bribery, the falsified death certificate. The identity of the John Doe whose body was used. She cleared her throat. It also explicitly states that you had no knowledge of the deception. You're protected, Mrs. Mitchell. The DA has confirmed you won't be prosecuted. Relief should have flooded through me. Instead, I felt hollow. Dr. Hayes had carried that secret for 23 years, and now he was gone, his confession outliving him as his final act of penance. I wondered if he'd found peace at the end, or if the weight of what he'd done had followed him into whatever came next. The insurance company, I said. They'll still want the money back. That's a civil matter. Your attorney can advise you better than I can. But between us? Detective Reyes lowered her voice. Given the circumstances, the fraud perpetrated against you, the evidence of your ignorance, the fact that you were a victim as much as the insurance company, I suspect they'll negotiate. They don't want the publicity of going after a widow who was deceived by her own husband. After we hung up, I called Rachel Torres, the attorney who had been guiding us through this labyrinth. She confirmed what Detective Reyes had suggested. The insurance company was more interested in recovering what they could from Richard's assets than in pursuing me. They'd made an offer I could repay a portion of the settlement over time with no admission of wrongdoing, and they'd drop any potential claim against me. How much? I asked. 200,000. Spread over 10 years. With no interest. It was more than I had. More than I could afford on my nursing salary. But James had offered to contribute his guilt money. He called it the $200,000 Richard had paid him for his silence. Sarah had offered to help too, despite having 3 children and a mortgage of her own. Even Michael Jr., 5 years sober and finally stable, had said he'd pitch in whatever he could. We would manage. We had always managed. Take the deal, I said. The arrest happened on a Thursday. I watched it on the evening news, surrounded by my children in my living room. Richard Robert Santos, as the anchor called him, was led out of a San Diego hotel in handcuffs, his face a mask of manufactured dignity. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than I earned in a month, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture straight. He looked like a man being inconvenienced rather than a man facing decades in prison. He doesn't even look sorry. Sarah whispered. He's never been sorry, James said. He's only ever been sorry he got caught. Michael Jr. said nothing. He just reached for my hand and held it while the news anchor listed the charges. Insurance fraud, identity fraud, conspiracy, bribery of a public official, filing false documents. Federal charges would likely follow, she said. The FBI was investigating potential wire fraud and money laundering connected to his restaurant empire. The camera captured his face one final time before he was placed in the back of a police car. For just a moment, a single frame that I would replay in my memory for years, his mask slipped, and underneath it, I saw something I hadn't expected. Fear. The man who had abandoned us, who had let us grieve for 23 years, who had built a castle on the foundation of our suffering, he was finally afraid. It wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough to undo what he had done, but it was a start. The trial began in October, when the leaves in Boston had turned gold and crimson, and the air carried that particular crispness that always reminded me of new beginnings. Richard Mitchell, the prosecution refused to acknowledge his Robert Santos identity, sat at the defense table in a Navy suit, his silver hair now showing traces of gray at the roots. 6 months in custody had aged him. The confident restaurateur who had been paraded on local news as Entrepreneur of the Year had been replaced by something smaller, diminished. He still held his chin high, still arranged his features into an expression of dignified suffering, but the performance had lost its polish. I sat in the front row of the gallery with my children on either side of me. Sarah gripped my left hand. Michael Jr. held my right. James sat at the end, his shoulders hunched forward as if bracing for a blow. We had agreed to attend every day of the trial, to bear witness to the destruction of the man who had destroyed us. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. ADA Catherine Park, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, began with the insurance fraud. She walked the jury through the timeline. The gambling debts, the threats from Frank DeLuca, the desperate plan. She showed them the falsified death certificate, the dental records that had been fabricated to match a homeless man whose real name was never discovered. She played the audio recordings that Dr. Hayes had made before his death, his voice thin and reedy, but clear enough to damn Richard completely. The defendant didn't just commit fraud, ADA Park told the jury. He committed murder. The murder of his own identity. Yes, but also the murder of a family. He killed the husband Eleanor Mitchell believed she had. He killed the father his children deserved. And he did it not out of love, not out of protection, but out of cowardice. Richard's attorney, a high-priced defense lawyer named William Crawford, tried to paint a different picture. He spoke of a man trapped by circumstances, terrorized by violent criminals, desperate to protect his family from forces beyond his control. He produced character witnesses from San Diego who spoke of Robert Santos's generosity, his community involvement, his devotion to his second family. This is a man who made an impossible choice, Crawford argued. A man who chose to sacrifice himself, his identity, his relationships, everything he knew to keep his family safe. Was it legal? No. Was it ethical? That's for philosophers to debate. But was it understandable? I submit that every person in this courtroom, faced with the same impossible circumstances, might have made the same choice. I watched the jury's faces during that speech. Some of them seemed moved. One woman in the back row was nodding slightly, her eyes glistening. Then Ada Park called me to the stand. I had prepared for this moment. Rachel Torres had coached me on what to expect, what questions would be asked, how to maintain composure. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of sitting in that wooden chair, raising my right hand, and swearing to tell the truth about the worst betrayal of my life. Mrs. Mitchell. Ada Park began gently. Can you describe for the jury what your life was like in the years following your husband's supposed death? I told them about the double shifts. The nights I came home so exhausted I could barely climb the stairs, only to find bills piled on the kitchen table and children who needed things I couldn't provide. I told them about Sarah's panic attacks, about finding her hyperventilating in her closet at 3 a.m. because she dreamed her father was calling for help and she couldn't reach him. I told them about Michael Jr., spiral into addiction, the rehab facilities I couldn't afford, the night I found him unconscious in the backyard and thought I was going to lose another member of my family. I told them about James, 15 years old and suddenly the man of the house, working after school and weekends, giving up his chance at a real college because we needed his income. And during all of this, Ada Park asked, "Where was the defendant?" I looked at Richard. He was staring at the table in front of him, his jaw tight. "Building a restaurant empire in San Diego," I said. "Marrying another woman. Raising 2 more children. Living the life he told us he was too dead to have." The courtroom was silent. Crawford's cross-examination tried to establish that Richard had suffered too, that his separation from his first family had caused him genuine pain. He pointed to the journal entries, the passages where Richard wrote about missing his children, about the guilt that kept him awake at night. "Mrs. Mitchell," Crawford asked, "isn't it possible that your husband, that Richard truly believed he was protecting you?" I considered the question carefully. "It's possible he told himself that," I said. "It's possible he needed to believe it to sleep at night. But protection doesn't look like abandonment. Protection doesn't look like letting your children struggle while you build a mansion in La Jolla. Protection doesn't look like bribing your own son to keep quiet while your daughter has panic attacks and your other son nearly drinks himself to death." I paused. What Richard did wasn't protection. It was escape. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, I held my breath. Sarah's nails dug into my palm. Michael Jr. whispered something under his breath. A prayer, maybe, or a curse. James sat rigid, staring straight ahead. On the count of insurance fraud in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of identity fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of bribery of a public official, we find the defendant guilty. 4 counts. 4 guilty verdicts. Richard's face remained impassive, but I saw his hands trembling where they rested on the table. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for December. But as the bailiffs led Richard away, he turned and looked at me. Really looked at me. For the first time since the trial began. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear across the crowded courtroom. "I'm sorry." I turned away. The sentencing hearing fell on the first Wednesday of December, when Boston was blanketed in fresh snow and the city sparkled with early Christmas lights. Judge Robert Hartwell, a man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness and an intolerance for theatrics, presided over a courtroom filled to capacity. Journalists occupied the back rows, their notebooks ready. Maria Santos sat on the opposite side of the gallery with her children Carlos and Isabella, both looking shell-shocked and uncertain, caught between loyalty to the father that they'd known and our eyes met briefly. Maria gave me a small nod. I returned it. We were not friends. Perhaps we never would be. But we had become something else. Two women bonded by the same man's betrayal, navigating parallel griefs. ADA, Catherine Park, recommended the maximum sentence. 15 years for the insurance fraud, plus consecutive terms for the identity fraud, conspiracy, and bribery charges. The defendant's actions weren't a moment of desperation, she argued. They were a calculated, sustained deception, spanning more than 2 decades. He didn't just commit crimes, he built an entire life on them. While the family he abandoned suffered the consequences. William Crawford, ever the performer, pleaded for leniency. He cited Richard's age 67 now, and his deteriorating health. He spoke of the good Richard had done as Robert Santos, the employees who depended on his restaurants, the charitable contributions he'd made to San Diego community organizations. My client is not a monster, Crawford insisted. He is a flawed man who made terrible choices under impossible pressure. He has already lost everything that mattered to him. Further punishment serves no rehabilitative purpose. Then Judge Hartwell asked if the victims wished to make statements. I had written something. Pages of it, actually drafted and redrafted over sleepless nights, trying to find the words that could somehow capture 23 years of grief, anger, and exhaustion. But when I stood and walked to the podium, I left those pages in my purse. Your Honor, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. I was married to Richard Mitchell for 18 years before he died, or before I thought he died. I paused, letting the correction settle over the courtroom. I raised 3 children alone. I worked double shifts as a nurse, sometimes going 48 hours without sleep. I held my daughter while she hyperventilated from panic attacks. I sat in hospital waiting rooms while my son fought his way back from addiction. I watched my oldest boy sacrifice his dreams to help support our family. I turned to look at Richard. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Remorse, perhaps, or simply the performance of remorse. For 23 years, I believed I was a widow. I built my identity around that loss. I never remarried because I couldn't imagine loving anyone the way I loved Richard. I visited his grave every Sunday, rain or shine, and I talked to a headstone that marked an empty plot of earth. My voice cracked slightly. He let me do that. He knew, and he let me grieve a living man. I took a breath. I'm not here to ask for vengeance. I'm not here to demand the maximum sentence or to see Richard suffer. I've spent enough of my life being defined by what he did to me. What I want, what my children want, is to move forward, to build something new from the wreckage he left behind. I looked at the judge. Whatever sentence you impose, Your Honor, I trust it will be just. But justice isn't what will heal my family. Only time and love can do that, and we've already wasted too much of both on Richard Mitchell. I returned to my seat. Sarah was crying silently. Michael Jr. squeezed my hand. James stared at the floor, his shoulders shaking. Judge Hartwell sentenced Richard to 12 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 8. Additionally, he ordered full restitution to the insurance company and the establishment of a trust fund for Richard's victims, meaning us funded by whatever remained of his seized assets after legal fees and fines. 12 years. Richard would be 79 when he was released, if he survived that long. As the bailiffs led him away, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a strange lightness. A weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying had finally lifted from my shoulders. The healing didn't happen all at once. It came in fragments, in small moments that accumulated over months. It came when Sarah called to tell me she'd gone an entire week without a panic attack, the first time in years. When Michael Jr. celebrated 6 years of sobriety with a cake his sponsor had baked. When James finally enrolled in the college program he'd abandoned 2 decades ago, determined to finish his degree. It came when Maria Santos reached out to me in February, suggesting we meet for coffee. We sat in a quiet cafe in Cambridge, two women who should have been enemies, and discovered we had more in common than the man who had deceived us both. She told me about her children's therapy sessions, about the slow process of rebuilding their sense of identity. I told her about my own family's journey, the setbacks and the breakthroughs. By the time we parted, we had exchanged phone numbers and a tentative promise to stay in touch. It came when I finally cleaned out the attic in March, boxing up the last of Richard's belongings, the things I'd kept for sentimental reasons that now felt like relics of a lie. His college sweater, the watch his father had given him, the love letters he'd written during our courtship, full of promises he would eventually break. I donated everything to Goodwill, except for one photograph. Richard holding James as a newborn, his face full of wonder and joy. I kept that photo not for myself, but for my children. Because whatever else Richard had done, he had given me them, and they deserved to remember a time when their father's love had been real, or at least had seemed real. Spring arrived early that year. I planted tulips in the garden, yellow ones like the roses I used to bring to Richard's grave. But these were for me, for the new life I was building. The grave itself I hadn't visited since the trial ended. I wasn't sure I ever would again. 2 years after Richard's sentencing, I received a phone call from the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. Richard was dead. A heart attack, they said. Sudden. Unexpected. He had been in the prison library, reading a novel about a man who sails around the world alone. The guards found him slumped in his chair, the book still open in his lap. He was 69 years old. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I hung up the phone, watching the afternoon light shift across the walls. I expected to feel something grief, perhaps, or relief, or that particular satisfaction that comes when a villain meets his end. Instead, I felt nothing. A vast, echoing emptiness where emotion should have been. My children came to me that evening, gathering in the living room the way we had gathered so many times over the past 2 years. Sarah brought wine. Michael Jr. brought his 6-month sobriety chip, which he turned over and over in his fingers like a talisman. James brought the news that Maria Santos had already called him, asking what we wanted to do about arrangements. "There has to be a funeral," Sarah said quietly. "His children, Maria's children, they'll want closure. Do we owe them that?" Michael Jr. asked. "Do we owe him that?" I thought about the question for a long time. Richard had stolen 23 years of my life, had let me mourn a living man, had allowed my children to suffer while he built a paradise on the foundation of our pain. He had lied, and cheated, and manipulated everyone who loved him. He had died without ever truly atoning for what he'd done. But he was still their father. Carlos and Isabella, those 2 young people caught in the crossfire of their father's deception, they deserved a chance to say goodbye, and perhaps in some strange way, so did we. "We'll go," I said finally. "Not for him, for us, for them, for everyone who needs to see this ended." The funeral was held in San Diego, at a small chapel overlooking the ocean. Maria Santos had arranged everything. The flowers, the readings, the guest list, carefully curated, to include only those who knew the full truth. There would be no pretense here, no eulogies celebrating the life of Robert Santos. This was a funeral for Richard Mitchell, the man who had lived 2 lives and destroyed both. My children and I flew out together, staying at the same hotel where we had planned our confrontation 2 years earlier. The city looked different now, softer somehow, less hostile. Or perhaps it was me who had changed. Maria met us at the chapel doors. She had aged in the past 2 years, her dark hair now streaked with gray, but there was a steadiness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. We embraced without words, 2 women who had traveled parallel roads of grief and emerged, somehow, on the other side. Carlos and Isabella stood near the front of the chapel, uncertain and uncomfortable. They had spent 2 years grappling with the revelation that their father had been a fraud, that their entire childhood had been built on lies. I walked over to them and did something I hadn't expected to do. I hugged them, None of this was your fault, I told them, holding Isabella's hands in mine. Whatever he did, he loved you. That part was real. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. How do you know? Because I saw it, I said. In the photographs, in the way he built his life around you. He was capable of love. He just wasn't capable of honesty. I paused. Maybe that's the tragedy. He could have had both families, if he'd been brave enough to tell the truth. The service was brief. A minister spoke words about redemption and forgiveness that felt hollow in the face of what Richard had done. Maria read a poem about letting go. Carlos and Isabella shared memories of their father's birthday parties and soccer games and quiet evenings watching the sunset from their La Jolla patio. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium and looked out at the small gathering, my children, Maria's children, a handful of others who had been touched by Richard's deception. I had prepared remarks, but once again, I found myself speaking from somewhere deeper. I buried Richard Mitchell 25 years ago, I said. I stood at his grave and watched them lower an empty casket into the ground, and I believed my life was over. For 2 decades, I defined myself by that loss. I was Richard's widow, Richard's mourner, Richard's ghost. I took a breath. 2 years ago, I discovered the truth. I learned that the man I had loved, the man I had grieved, had been alive all along, living a life I knew nothing about, with a family I never imagined. I was angry, furious, devastated in ways I didn't know I could be devastated. I looked at my children, then at Maria's. But standing here today, burying him for real this time, I realized something. Richard Mitchell did die 25 years ago. The man who faked his death, who built a new identity, who lied to everyone who loved him that wasn't the Richard first married. That was someone else. Someone I never knew. My voice steadied. So today, I'm not mourning Richard Mitchell. I'm releasing him. I'm letting go of the anger and the grief and the questions that will never have answers. I'm choosing to remember the 18 years we had before everything fell apart, the laughter, the love, the 3 beautiful children we raised together. I smiled faintly. That's the Richard I'll carry with me. The rest, I leave in this chapel. After the service, we scattered Richard's ashes in the Pacific Ocean, watching the waves carry him away toward a horizon he would never reach. Sarah slipped her hand into mine. How do you feel? I watched the water sparkle in the fading sunlight. Thought about all the years behind me, and all the years still ahead. Free, I said finally. I feel free, and for the first time in 25 years, I meant it.